Hi, I'm Alex Bowman and I work in the School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. My research explores pre-market or commons approaches to housing and productivity. This very brief presentation outlines what a common is, why it's important, and how a modern and urban commons initiative could be supported by combining already existing government policy settings. At its core, a commons approach involves living on a common as opposed to private land. It also involves work that's typically local, collaborative, and subsistence based. My research sees a role for this commons approach to help balance the social and ecological downsides of our current exclusive reliance on market forms of paid work and private housing. Okay, so what these scholars, these post-development scholars, Gibson and Graham, are sharing with us here is that this commons idea of economy is far from fringe. In fact, use of common land and local subsistence productivity, so a non sort of marketized form of development, it's a form of economic participation that has underpinned human settlement for most of the world's economic history and in fact continues in much of the world today in both urban and rural settings in South America, in Asia, in the Africas. We still see this non-market form of productivity. So just by way of a bit of history, this big shift away from the common mode of human operation, of course, began with European enclosures in around the 16th century in Europe, and then it spread globally through colonisation. This is a phenomenon, this land enclosure, that Marx termed primitive accumulation, where the market often violently took possession of the means of production of land. Of course, then this was the birth of the working class because once land was removed, the proletariat were left with nothing but their labour to sell. And this is the situation we very much face today. Land is private. This involves putting people into a lifetime of mortgage or rental debt. They therefore have to sell their labour in the marketplace. This colonisation, of course, is a phenomenon continuing today with the enclosures of many lands. We're seeing much enclosure happening now in the Africas. This a quote from around the time of European enclosure kind of gets to the heart of the sort of crime that's at the centre of this. They hang the man and flog the woman that steals the goose from the common, but let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose. So the idea that land is not essentially a market product, it's nature. We all, like air and water, we all need it to survive. Its privatisation essentially is what then, of course, commodifies our labour, which we must then sell to the market. And terms like mortgage, slave, of course, come from this idea that we are sort of part of this commitment to capitalism that's not in fact free, although freedom is considered one of the ways we sell the idea of capitalist, liberal democratic society. In fact, quite to the contrary, we've enclosed, we've privatised nature and therefore bonded our labour to the market. In most of our people's minds these days, of course, the market way of living, private land and paid work has become sort of ubiquitous. It's the only thing we know. It's like that image you sometimes see of of a child asking a fish in a fish bowl, how's the water? And the fish responds, what's water? It's the only thing. If something's the only thing you know, of course, you don't question it. This slide here seeks to contrast these two sort of economic modes of operation. Of course, there's the paid, there's private land and paid work, but a commons, the oldest human economy approach, the most indigenous economy to all of us, is this idea of land being held in common and then work being freed from the market, being local and collaborative in nature. And yet we have this ubiquitous notion of economy. In fact, economists have rendered non-capitalist economic activity sort of non-credible or non-existent. We don't recognize it in any of our World Bank indicators of development. We only really consider market forms of development. So why return to a discussion about this commons form of development? I think the key reason is that the market system is facing serious both ecological and social problems. We've really run into what's being called a sort of a limits to growth idea, where the more and more production and consumption that's required to give us the 3% annual growth we need has sort of hit an ecological wall. There's many, of course, social downsides now to the market. Many people alienated in terms of employment and housing, and a welfare system that simply doesn't keep up. And even if it does, of course, the construction of people who don't succeed in markets as being welfare dependent has problems as well. What if there were other ways to be a successful economic citizen than simply paid housing and work? What if there was a more commons way that came back to our Indigenous heritage, all of our Indigenous heritage, both in European commons and Indigenous ways of knowing that aren't market oriented? So there's a need here to sort of open up another economic space. What's key to opening up this alternative economic space is really at its foundation related to our relationship to land. Just as markets began with the very first initial privatisation of land through land enclosures, which is recognised by all great economic philosophers, Adam Smith, John Locke, Karl Marx, Proudhon. All these people point to land enclosure or privatisation as being the very central thing that established the market system, because then, of course, labour had to be privatised to buy the land back. To this day, the mortgage is still the thing that ties us to markets. Mortgage coming from the Latin debt till death. This is the essential debt, or rent will be the lifelong debt that then, of course, forces us into finding market opportunity. We've seen now with COVID, what happens when market opportunity declines. When it really comes down to its foundation is a fear of homelessness, of being dispossessed. So we must keep these market opportunities, which means, of course, we need growth. This third image here. Now, many of us are trying to green this growth through moving from carbon-based, technology to renewable technology, and that's great that we're looking at that shift. But essentially, it's the same system. We're not changing any foundation here. We still rely on growth, and of course, we're starting to see problems with a shift to renewable if we still require that 3% growth each year. And countries like China and India need to catch up with our growth. Even renewables present an ecological challenge in that regard if we just always rely on ever more growth. The question I ask with the commons approach is, could it help balance this idea that everyone is forced into a market and market growth opportunity? Could it sit alongside markets and help to remedy the downsides, the alienation socially that goes on, and the ecological pressures for growth? So here we have a key question. What would a sustainable lifestyle look like? It would need to not be as growth or as consumeristic dependent. The recent UN gap report, emissions gap report, tells us that the world could sustain, the 8 billion or so of us now and the 10 billion by 2050, having lifestyles that produced about 2.1 tonnes of carbon emissions a year per person. We in the West, in countries like Australia, average people like you and I, produce around 20 tonnes of carbon per year in the way we get our food, in the way that we get around, in our leisure activities and so on. How do we make this huge shift, this incredible multi-fold decrease in our lifestyles? How do we shift from a sort of a growth society dependence to what Ted Trainer at New South Wales University calls a conserver society type of lifestyle? Many people are attempting this on top of land privatisation, particularly middle-aged intellectuals, universities who see the importance of degrowth, and they're out there in the burbs on their secured land, reducing their consumption. And this is all well and good, but for anyone seeking to follow them, you're talking about a lifetime of market buy-in to secure anything like the type of land opportunity those people have, and that's a lot of economic growth. The Neighbourhood That Works strategy is building supports to help unemployed public housing residents who are actually already on non-private land, to help them to choose to be involved in local and cooperative community development work. Such local and productive participation on public land could become a modern and urban example of commons living. This could help to make sustainable and vibrant neighbourhoods that work. At its core, Neighbourhood That Work holds that for those who choose it, gaining access to public land and being locally productive is a legitimate way to meet housing and a range of other basic needs. After all, land, just like air and water, is a common good, not really a market good. Local productivity on common land as a way of meeting housing and other basic needs is the oldest and most universal mode of human development. The Neighbourhood That Works project seeks to restore this commons opportunity by connecting people back to land, productive skills, and community. As hopeful as all this might sound, unemployed public residents can already participate in this sort of local productivity as a satisfaction of Centrelink's requirements for their income support. Unemployed over 55s can meet Centrelink's mutual obligations for income support by choosing to participate in around 15 hours a week of voluntary work. Those who are under 55 can also do this, but they must gain approval, and they're generally limited to 12 months of such voluntary activity. There are many volunteer activities that meet the requirements for voluntary work. From volunteer work in a local non-profit like a neighbourhood centre or a bush regeneration organisation, to an involvement in an auspiced community development program like a community garden or a tool or toy library, things like cooking classes, bicycle repairs, or even building maintenance programs. The Neighbourhood That Works project seeks to promote and expand on these existing voluntary work programs and provide other much needed supports, particularly for long-term unemployed public residents who might choose them. In terms of who typically takes up voluntary work, we've identified three broad groups. The first group are people who do not choose to take part at all. Voluntary work is purely voluntary, and so income benefits are totally unaffected for people who simply aren't interested. For the second group, voluntary work is usually chosen as part of a sort of a shorter term pathway to employment, to develop new skills and contacts, and to move towards the job and the income they want. For a third group, who may face longer term unemployment, voluntary work is chosen as a great way to stay productive, stay connected to the community, and satisfy Centrelink's requirements for income support. To make these voluntary work programs more successful, the Neighbourhood That Works strategy is seeking to build partnerships around the following improvements to the existing voluntary work program. The first of these improvements relates to developing suitable resident-led voluntary programs and organisational methods. Community-led and professionally supported programs is something participants themselves are at the centre of building. To support them, the Neighbourhood That Works project is developing an organisational framework called Village for facilitating exactly this sort of grassroots development. A second improvement that is much needed is a wide-scale promotion of voluntary work programs. While these programs are currently available to unemployed residents, they're not well taken up or even known about. A longer-term goal would involve expanding the unrestricted option that's currently available to over 55s, where they can do voluntary work at will and for as long as they like, to those who are under 55 who can currently only do it if it's approved and for a year. We think this could find quite strong political support because if someone's willing to do 30 hours a fortnight of voluntary work, that should be evidence enough that they're active and willing to be involved. They'd be developing new skills and they'd be staying active. The incentive of a high income alone for many people will see them take jobs as soon as they can get them. And we know that even if they remain unemployed in this period, it's a productive experience, this 15 hours or 30 hours a fortnight. Ultimately, if it was well supported, voluntary work for those who chose it could help counter the dependency framing public housing is currently stuck with. If it was promoted well, this reframing of public housing could even foster renewed public support and investment in public housing. Okay, so thank you for your time, and I hope you found the Neighbourhood That Works approach interesting and relevant to your focus. If you'd like to take part in supporting this strategy, please check out our website and get in contact.